Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Integrated Transport webinar looking at socially necessary services, franchising and DRT in rural areas. With the local transport minister supporting rural bus franchising and pilot schemes in the horizon, this is a good time to be looking at how we can make integrated rural transport a reality. I'm Beate Kubitz. I'm a transport consultant working in digitalisation, the way that reduces car dependency. That means connecting people to public transport network through mobility as a service, demand responsive transport, walking, rolling and cycling. And I've worked for public authorities, commercial clients, and I just had a book on mobility as a service published last year. I'm a visiting lecturer for the University of Hertfordshire. And with me today, I've got Melanie Watson. Melanie has spent 30 years working in public transport, holding key roles with Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester at Cornwall Council, and has now become an independent consultant. She's delivered effective partnerships with the private sector through her career, including Transport for Cornwall, and she's just recently been supporting Transport for Greater Manchester with its recent implementation. Having worked and lived in both rural and urban areas, she's very well aware of the issues of implementing rural transport delivery. I've also got John Taylor, who's a director of the Task Partnership and the chair of Preston Community Transport. He claims to have been sucked into transport as a volunteer driver in 1977 and has never escaped. He's co-founded what has now become the Community Transport Association and has worked as both an operator and in consultancy since 1986. His first contract was with the as a rural transport business advisor for the Council for Small Industries in rural areas, covering taxi and minibus operators. He's worked for the Rural Development Commission and the Countryside Agency. So a long and illustrious career, over 30 years of working in community transport issues across the UK. He's currently, besides working for the TAS Partnership, the chair of Preston Community Transport, operating social car schemes and a limited minibus service across half of Lancashire. I've also got James West, who's probably worked on DRT as long as anyone has in the UK. He's had almost a decade working on demand responsive transports, including the very first DRT in the UK in Bristol. And he has operational knowledge and has worked with technological suppliers. So James currently leads the growth of Padam Mobility in the UK and Ireland, working with local authorities to support their ambitions to launch, grow or digitalise their on-demand services. So welcome everyone. And I think if we can move first of all to Melanie's presentation.
Right, thank you and good morning. Thanks everybody for joining us. As mentioned, I'm Melanie Watson. I've lived and worked in the Southwest for over 10 years now, largely at Cornwall Council, either directly managing their transport team or the programme team that delivered bus fares pilot, or supporting them as a consultant. I'm currently working for Peninsula Transport, which is a sub-regional transport body here in the Southwest, looking at a better buses package that we're hoping to deliver across 5 local transport authorities. And as Beate already mentioned, I've worked in London and also Manchester, so I understand the urban perspective well as the more recent rural experience. I've most recently been supporting TfGM with their transition to franchising. So that's really opened my eyes around the challenges of putting bus networks back into public control. And obviously I can understand the rural context living in deep and beautiful Devon. So next slide, please. So I thought I'd start off with this. It's really to talk about the wider challenges the industry is currently facing. And I think we've got a real challenge ahead in that how do we make public transport, buses in particular, desirable? The car industry does an incredible job and many people just don't give public transport a second thought. It's simply not on their radar. So the DFT did some excellent segmentation work a few years ago, and it was really quite stark that we're way off meeting some of the basic needs that people expect when it comes to public transport. So we have a real uphill challenge to even get people to think about using it. Since COVID, we've also lost the elderly. We're not seeing the young flock to bus. They're more likely to call it Uber where they exist. They don't exist in Devon, or certainly not where I live, which I'm glad to say, and long may that stay that way. Many women who traditionally would be bus users are now car owners, and I can't see them as they enter the age of the free bus pass giving up their cars. So, you know, the industry has some real challenges. But we need to do better at trying to get people to think about bus for some of their journeys. And research shows that if people start to make the odd journey by bus and it goes well, not wrong, not late, not turning up, all that sort of stuff. But if the bus journey goes well, they may well consider it again, and they'll maybe try it for different journeys. And slowly over time, they may use it more frequently. So it's key that we get people to try the bus and that we deliver good services that then make them realise they can actually use the bus for some of their journeys. We need to really change the narrative around bus and make it more desirable, more hip for the young, you know, or even just the easy choice, easier than picking up those car keys. And this needs a lot more leadership. It needs a change in the way we think and utilise bus. And we need advocates and politicians, stakeholders, all of us that lead by example and use the bus if we're going to start the narrative and really get people out of that beautiful yellow car and onto those beautiful red, green, yellow, whatever colour buses they are, but that's what we need to see. So that's just a little introduction to some of the bigger issues. Next slide, please. So obviously today we're talking about rural transport, and you know, it's very much how do we get people to use public transport, in particular buses in rural areas. And I think I wanted to start off by saying there's a lot of really good work and some excellent rural bus services that do already exist across the UK. Authorities and operators have worked well together to pool resources and deliver a step change in many of our rural areas, but real challenges do exist. And this picture, you know, we've got a nice modern bus, we've got a bus stop with a flag, we've got timetable information, we've even got hard standing for the passenger. There might be a lot of grass around, but at least there's somewhere hard for that passenger to stand. So, you know, getting the basics there, you know, we've got it in some cases, but this is often the exception. So really getting this right across the network remains a key challenge and will take a lot of money. Rural services are not usually high in frequency, so connections are often more important than in urban areas where you can turn up and go. And I would question, you know, is it sufficient thought and attention given to that integration piece and connections within rural areas? Are rail and bus well linked to provide seamless journeys? And again, there's really good pockets of good practice, but it's simply not the norm, and that is the challenge we're up against. Privatisation over the years hasn't helped. You know, I saw the same national group running bus and train services not talking to one another, and it took another operator to come in and engage and actually make those connections because the bus and rail people in one group didn't do it. You know, so, you know, services have become compartmentalised and they're not integrated as well as they should be. So there's specific challenges that we've really got to face up to in the rural environment in particular. And that we need to provide a really attractive network for customers to be able to rely on buses in the rural areas. So next slide, please. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the specific challenges of rural transport. It is very well documented, but very briefly, we know that the cost of rural services is far higher. And that's because rural services often do longer routes. There's a lot of dead mileage involved at times. There's sparse populations. And that, you know, there can be challenges in terms of drivers, getting drivers to provide these bus services. That leads to often lower patronage levels. You know, these routes are going through lower population densities. And basically, because of the cost of these longer routes, quite often you can't justify the frequency, and therefore that lower frequency deters passengers. All of this means that more funding is often required, and due to the higher costs, lower patronage, very few routes are really commercially viable. And we've seen really stark examples of how commerciality has declined in rural areas over the last few years, particularly since COVID. But we were already on that downward trend. So, you know, there are significant financial pressures. We've seen inflation hit the bus industry over the last couple of years, and we've seen local authority finances really taking a battering and other priorities becoming more important. You know, adult social care, home to school transport, all of that has really taken off in terms of taking the lion's share of budget available within local authority areas. In terms of infrastructure, quite often, not always, but, you know, rural services quite often have older vehicles. Cornwall was called the graveyard of buses 10 years ago. You know, it was where buses were sent to retire. You know, they've done a lot of work to reverse that. But, you know, if vehicles are old, they often have reliability issues that, again, can undermine customer perception. You know, we've already seen an example of a reasonable bus stop in a rural location, but quite often, you know, there's not sufficient bus infrastructure, shelters, you know, maintenance can be hit and miss. And then quite often there's a lack of consistency. You've often got different people taking control of the infrastructure, town councils, local councils, you know, and it all leads to a hodgepodge of infrastructure that is out there, which again doesn't give the customer confidence. Buses often go into towns as well. These towns can often not be supported by bus priority, and that can delay services. And if you've got a long rural route, people in the rural areas don't understand why buses are late. So again, it all adds up to a vicious circle which undermines perception and fuels, you know, that negativity around rural bus services. You often have disjointed information. You might have a lot of small operators providing services, which is all very all good. You know, SMEs can provide some excellent local services, but if they're all doing their own thing around information, you know, it can be very hard for passengers to understand, where do we get this information? How do we access that bus route? They might have all different fares operating as well. So yeah, lots of challenges, but, you know, lots of opportunities as well. So on to the next slide, please. In terms of rural transport, does franchising, you know, solve any of these issues? And I don't believe it actually does. Rural transport in general terms has been on this cycle of decline, and we have to face up to the fact that it costs a lot of money to provide good rural bus services. Funding is the issue here, not the delivery mechanism. And many rural authorities at present do not invest significant sums in the bus network. You know, I worked at Cornwall Council. That was one of the lucky authorities where they had large budgets to pump into public transport. But, you know, it's still not enough to do what everything that they want to do. So, you know, rural authorities are not putting the money in for very good reason. But, you know, if you don't have the money, what is franchising going to resolve? You know, we've got a lot of sticking plasters in place, and therefore I challenge whether simply moving to a franchise model will actually make the change. So going into the next slide, I just want to take a very quick deep dive into creating that vision and having this vision-led approach. And it's something that was done in Cornwall. It's been very successful in Cornwall. I see other authorities are following a similar approach now, which is great to see. But it's about, how do you present to the customers one network within an area? And that may not just be local authority within your local authority boundary. You need to look at where people are travelling to and from and work with colleagues across boundaries to make sure you are presenting a good rural network. Looking at one timetable, one map, one website, one app, one ticket, just making it very simple. So going on to the next slide. You know, Cornwall got its operators together. They've delivered joint publicity. The operators have led on this. It's removed duplication. We previously had operators and Cornwall Council all doing a bit of all of this and duplicating effort. So we've got one approach to information provision now across the whole county. It's simple, it's consistent, it reduces duplication, and it makes it a lot easier for the passenger to actually find out what is going on in Cornwall. Going on to the next slide. They also, so quite often ticketing is seen as the big challenge. And how do you do this unless you've got control of the network under franchising? Well, Cornwall did do it. It delivered interoperability. It brought its operators together, commercial agreements were put in place, and operators now accept each other's tickets. They simplified the terminology of the tickets, and also the product range was simplified. And they agreed 5 simple fare bands that all operators, including Cornwall Council tendered routes, now use. And customer research showed that value matters, but they recognise that fares need to go up as well. So plan for it, publicise it. The idea that there will be a fare increase every year, just like on your mobile phone bill, is quite acceptable. So don't be afraid of fare increases either. So going on to the next slide. The role of local transport authorities is evolving, in my view, and I think we need to do, well, can we afford to just do more of the same, or are we just managing decline? Do we need to take a more radical approach to rural transport provision? And I think the first thing we need to be doing is working more collaboratively across boundaries, looking at, the bus routes don't stop at boundaries, and passengers don't care about administrative boundaries. Can we do more by working closer together? Not many BSIPs were jointly delivered, and we were all given that option at the time. And I question, why weren't there more joint BSIPs? With the formation, we are now seeing with the formation of combined authorities, that authorities are now coming together and they're really looking at this. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's good. And I think we need to look at how do we pool our resources and look at a strategic vision across an area so that we can provide that bigger picture. So going on to the next page. I do think it is the local transports authority to now deliver that one public transport network in collaboration with stakeholders, with operators, but it is for the authorities to now lead. The BSIPs are in place, but we've got to rebase the transport conversation. We need to understand what the role of bus is within our respective areas. Bus can drive greater social mobility, it can drive economic growth, but it needs to be supported. And I think we need to change the conversation around bus. It's not about filling gaps in the network. It's about delivering a network that underpins the wider aspirations for the areas that we're talking about. So really looking at how do you drive growth and revenue. Obviously, we need revenue to reinvest and getting sharing agreements in place with operators. We need to think about what our core routes are. And DFT have obviously put this idea of socially necessary services into the latest buses bill. I think that's a real opportunity and something not to be afraid of. Some of these services are required for your areas, and we should be held accountable to providing them. And we need to find the money to deliver those services. It's key that we don't duplicate, that we work out who is best to deliver certain elements. And we need to look at strategic links and cross-boundary priorities and join up and look beyond our own areas. There's also ticketing. And I would question, why do we have local authorities with multiple fare bands when we've got operators, commercial operators, simplifying their fare bands on the back of the £2 and £3 fares? Let's get to grips with all of this and let's simplify and make it far easier for the passenger to use bus services. Going on to the next slide, nearly done. One size does not fit all. And I think we do have to be mindful of that. The BSIPs have started the conversation and all the challenges are out there, but each area is unique in its own way, but there are many similarities as well between areas. Funding is filling some of the gaps that we have, but each area needs to work out what does that bus network need to do, and then it needs to drive the change. It's really important that we need to step up funding in rural areas, and that's not about waiting for the handouts, it's about making the case for the wider things that bus can do to underpin and support that area. We need to take ownership and think big, think collaboration, and really start to change the narrative around the bus. And only then really can we start to think about the best delivery mechanism. So then just going on to the next slide, we know that there is lots of different ways that franchising can be delivered. We've got Manchester, the big bang approach, costing lots of money, but there's lots of different ways that we can look at franchising. We can think about tendered routes, and could different outcomes be achieved from when you look at retendering those routes. Cornwall took all their network as a whole, in terms of the whole tender network, and delivered a massive increase in mileage through one big contract that was let over 8 years and got huge investment in. Why are other authorities not doing similar? But it is a fine balancing act. It is really hard, and that decisions are going to have to be made to deliver growth. You might not be able to deliver the coverage and deliver the growth straight away. And, it is recognised that this will take time and sustained funding, and it's also questionable around the political will. On the side there, that's the list of potential types of franchising. So again, there are options out there. So just to conclude, buses are really key to supporting equality, social mobility, and and to facilitate economic growth. But we know they're hard to sustain. But we need to get out of our comfort zone, stop doing more of the same, think big, and make the change. Join things up, collaborate, find efficiencies, and really take that strategic approach to looking at what do we need the bus to do, and make it happen. Or we can continue doing what we do now. And it is not easy, but, access to transport really changed lives. And I love this picture. We've got to give the young, the old, the opportunities to access education. We've got to get people to work in our rural areas. So I don't think we can afford to be complacent and continue to manage decline. We need to find funding to deliver better rural bus services. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Melanie. Just a quick reminder for everyone that's watching the webinar, there's a Q&A box as well as the chat box. So if you have a very specific question, please put it in the Q&A box so I can keep an eye on those for the final element of the webinar, when we'll be looking at those questions. I can ask John to join us next. Hi, John.
Hi. If my slides can arrive. Hi. Good morning, everybody. I'm partly coming at this with somewhat cynical views from experience over the last 50 years, but mostly looking at this from the point of view of Preston community transport and my experience there. For context, Preston community transport is one of 5 community transport groups in Lancashire which have a collaborative consortium contract with the county council, which is a 5-year contract. I'm due to hear this week whether this has been renewed. Our tender has been successful, but at the moment, this is like a successful franchise, as it were, for community transport delivery across the whole authority area for a 5-year period. So next slide. Sorry about keep clicking. It wasn't like that when I left it. A bit of history, thinking about rural transport and the challenge for a community transport operator trying to think about how they fit in. The difficulty has been that we just haven't had a coherent national policy towards rural passenger transport support for as long as I've been working in the sector. What was needed was some concept of rural proofing, whether this might be a minimum expected service standard for particular sizes of rural settlements, but that's never been put into place, even though the Department for Transport did have a rural proofing function at one point. It had very limited practical effect. And instead, we've had a sort of series of ad hoc funding challenges with different objectives, different expectations, and in some cases, it's clear that the department and certainly politicians and some academics have a belief in what I describe as magic solutions. And the Total Transport initiative was indeed one of those that somehow by working together and pooling our resources, it would all become miraculously cheaper. The fact is there aren't any magical solutions for rural transport. It is inherently more expensive to deliver because of the longer journeys, the longer trip times, which means employing more driver time, and the lower vehicle occupancy. Next slide. So part of the context then is that we've seen this decline, steady decline in rural bus service provision, reflecting growth in car ownership and use, the changes in lifestyles in rural communities and the makeup of the rural community and the type of work that they're doing, and indeed the steady accretion of local transport authority funding available to supporting socially necessary services. So it raises the extent to which rural buses are now really a social rather than a public service, which implies that they're not really expecting to deliver modal shift, and they're not really expecting to be justified in terms of their economic contribution. From a community transport perspective, because of the focus on those people who are excluded from existing effective use of existing services, perhaps on grounds of age or disability or on grounds of poverty. Community transport is certainly in the social service side of the equation here. Cost benefit, social value assessments are really not going to help rebalance the urban-rural funding split simply because of the numbers involved, because that's what drives the pound signs. So we actually do require a specific commitment to supporting rural life. But that is not going to enable, in terms of affordability, the sort of urban levels of movement, what I've described as hypermobility. We can't afford it financially, but I don't think we can afford it environmentally either. Next slide, please. So that might seem doom and gloom, but as Melanie said, there's actually a lot of good work going on in the face of the inherent difficulties that we've got. I've listed off the top of my head a number of examples, which I cite to other people on occasions, but this could have been pages and pages long. A number of these are community transport examples. I'll give the example there of the community bus, which predated the 1978 Transport Act and has been going strong ever since, providing an excellent service in that area of Sussex. And the example of the Age UK and Volunteer Cornwall, Transport to Health service, transport access patient service, and the volume of car scheme trips that they deliver on a one-to-one basis, enabling people from Cornwall to access the General Hospital for Cornwall, which of course is not in Cornwall, it's over the border, over the Tamar into Plymouth. So it requires some really awkward and lengthy and difficult journeys, which the community transport sector is providing. There are some common features of some of the delivery examples, which they're quite small in scale. They've got a local focus and local support. Almost all of them, you can identify somebody who has the sort of vision that Melanie was outlining. And there's a lot of effort and commitment. And that brings me on to the next slide, which is, what do we think community transport is about? What makes it distinct? Well, it certainly is about local activity. It's about self-help, and it is about community action and collective action where there are gaps in the state or private sector provision. And in our case, this is passenger transport provision. And the gaps may be geographical, they may be time-based, they may be about the quality, they may be about how inclusive the services are. A lot of community transport projects started because of the difficulties that people with disability had in using conventional services. And even now, when buses and trains are at least nominally physically accessible with PSVAR and the equivalent for the rail network, there is still a requirement for what I'd describe as a paratransit service, so paralleling the existing service for those people who still cannot make effective use of the public transport network. There's been, over the years, I think there's been two strands for community transport activity. The earlier strands were about rural access, and this has continued. So this is starting in the 1950s with the first organised car schemes and lift giving, and some of the earliest community buses in the 50s and 60s. This is before the legislation defining the sector came into play. And then a second strand of activity has been about social inclusion, particularly disability, but also poverty and other aspects of contributing to greater equality and less exclusion within local society. Obviously, the volunteer contribution adds value and sustainability, and this just isn't just about volunteer drivers, although that's a critical issue when it comes to the cost of rural transport. But it's also about the people who are actually managing the projects, because trustees are almost all unpaid. Because of the local basis of community transport and how they network to other third sector operations, to local churches, daycare and so on, it has a different networking model to that which the local authorities or the commercial sector can deliver. And that's one of the community transport strengths in terms of a different approach to service marketing. I want to come back to that. The sector can bring additional funding into passenger transport out with that which would normally be available for PSP operators. It scores well on any added social value assessments, but as I've pointed out, this may not help bring in extra money. And potentially, it has greater scope for innovation. Next slide, please. We have a wide range of models, of delivery models in play. I've started with car schemes because these tend to be ignored, but they are very substantial. They're widespread. There are lots of them, and although individually each scheme may not be delivering a huge number of trips, when you actually add them up across a local authority area, you will find that there is a substantial amount of movement going on. As we've seen with the one in Cornwall, where they're doing over 100,000 trips a year, and there are plenty of other local authority areas where similar volumes are in play. The next model, Section 19 permits, actually introduced in 1977. This enables third sector not-for-profit groups to provide services, but not for the public. Having said that, this can include isolated communities where there actually isn't an alternative service. So a Section 19 operator wouldn't come into conflict with an existing bus operator. Then you can deliver a service which is in effect open to the public in those isolated locations. And then there are Section 22 community bus operations, which are open to the public. And you have to start with at least one service which is registered as a local service. And thereafter, you can do other work which can financially contribute to the overall operation. And there have been those operations, those community bus operations, back to 1978, and indeed beforehand, because they were initially developed by the National Bus Company in half a dozen different locations. But on top of the sort of three core models, we also have community interest companies who are operating as social enterprise PSV operators. We've got community transports undertaking contract work for public bodies, although this can be currently sometimes problematic, a conflict with the Traffic Commissioner's interpretation of non-commercial. We have brokerage services to share out resources more effectively. Community transports operate car clubs, they operate self-drive services, particularly for small wheelchair accessible vehicles. They run rural transport hubs. They operate WAV, mobility scooter, cycle, e-bike hire, and so on. Wheels to work services with scooters or small e-bikes. And there are parish, town and district councils, Section 22 operators, so local authority run community bus services. But it's true that the regulatory basis for community transport has been creaking for some time. There's a mismatch between the way that the UK thinks about regulation and the way that the European community thinks about regulation. And even though Brexit has occurred, these two lines are still in conflict. So there's four different legal definitions, at least, of non-commercial in use, which creates difficulties for the sector. Next slide, please. Just thinking about what we mean by integration. Community transport is generally excluded from things like integrated ticketing and particularly concessionary travel reimbursement. and the latter, it seems to me, grossly inequitable, because we're asking those people who simply cannot make effective use of the concessionary travel arrangements on a conventional bus service because they can't get on it properly, to pay for a parallel transport service. And that, unfortunately, is the position that we're in at the moment. There are some examples of links, rail link services linked, and I've given some there, but these are pretty ad hoc and generally don't, although they may have rail partnership support, they don't generally have operator involvement, and that's rail operator involvement. There are some occasional examples of partnering with the major bus operators, although particularly with the Go Ahead group, who do get community transport generally, but there's the barrier that most community transport is not supposed to be operating incidental to work which is undertaken for profit. So one has to be quite careful about how the arrangements are established. There are blended activities, and I see somebody in the chat mentioned something like this, which involves contract packaging, where the local authority may be buying in SEN transport, and this is delivered by a community transport group, and on the back of that, they're delivering a low-cost inter-peak dial-a-bus service for people with disabilities. So rather than deal with the two things separately, you're dealing with them together. But that will only work if you have an integrated transport unit at the local authority, because otherwise you've got two separate internal clients, and it's not obvious why the education department or children's services should be interested in what happens to a vehicle that they're buying in for peak use in the off-peak. They simply want the lowest cost provision on the service that they need. And then there is some ad hoc internal integration. So Preston Community Transport has a dial-a-bus service which brings people into our mobility centre, where we also operate a shop mobility service with mobility scooters, and we've extended that to Preston bus station. So somebody can book ahead, they can arrive on bus, and we will meet them at the bus station with a mobility scooter. Okay, next slide.
We've got a minute left, John.
Right. There's a lot of text. I'm not going to go through all of this. There isn't a current model for incorporating community transport into franchises. And we have concerns, obviously, about the paperwork and the scale issues that are connected with that. But on the other hand, there is an opportunity to mainstream our paratransit services into the overall public transport network. So we do want to see inclusion. Next slide. We've looked at one model which is worth considering, which is the Dutch approach. They borrowed this actually from the UK community buses in the 1970s, and the idea of community buses is now incorporated into the regional passenger transport franchises. Not all of them, but the majority in the Netherlands, which does allow for local associations to operate community bus services and be supported through the franchise arrangements. And the particular distinction here is this is de-risked financially for the local community group which is delivering. And that's not the case in the UK. So this is supported through the franchising model by a combination of the Regional Transport Authority and the concession holder. And as you'll see from the next slide, there are some quite extraordinary timetables being delivered using volunteer drivers. That's probably using a sort of block of 30 volunteers. And it's a service I travelled on 30 years ago, and that was taken last night from the timetable. So they're still operating. It's a very stable operation. As we'll see from the next slide, some of the operations are actually in the franchise holder colours. So there's clear linking between the community delivery and the overall franchise network. And the services, the book bus services, appear in the overall timetables and the network maps. Next slide. So just thinking about Preston Community Transport, we already have a good relationship with the local authority, but there's more that can be done. We want to work closer with the authority on identifying gaps. We want to participate in bus partnerships. We do want to see joint ticketing on our public transport routes. We want to expand our dial-a-bus services and our car scheme services. We're catching up on the lost patronage following COVID, and there's a lot more to be done. We want to develop new services around rural DRT. We think we can make that more cost effective by linking it into rural mobility hubs and car club and car scheme operation. And we also intending to formalise our links to taxi and private hire operators to improve off-peak arrangements for our passengers. So that's what our aspiration is, but it's going to be quite difficult, we acknowledge, to specify that in a franchise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Fascinating insight into community transport. And now I've got James West to talk about some of the issues around integrating demand responsive transport into rural transport networks. Take it away, James.
Perfect. Thank you, Beate. And thank you also to Melanie and John. I'm going to try and echo some of those words and sort of themes in what I'm going to present. So if we can jump to the next slide, and I'll talk about how I think and how Padam thinks around, integrating rural transport more widely, and also how DRT can play its part. So you can see here, over 200 times we've deployed DRT services across Europe, and more specifically here in the UK through schemes such as the Rural Mobility Fund, or indeed any bus service improvement plan funding. And I think the large majority of these, therefore, are in their nature rural and isolated, and it's about generating access to public transport. But many of our services that you can see listed there in continental Europe, and those that we haven't got on the screen in France, are around that more European model of cross-regional integration, whether that's across a town or cities or even regions that span borders, and making sure that the services and modes that are then integrated are meaningful and accessible to users. I think it's about creating a transport system that is both well utilized, offers an attractive proposition to users, and then therefore can be sort of wider used across people's different habits, whether that's from commuting, whether that's to do leisure activities, but creating something that creates access to all and also benefits different types of journeys. And if we can jump onto the next slide, please. I think, why integration and why franchising now? I think we're at a really important and also exciting opportunity for transport here in the UK. Franchising is, hot on everyone's lips. There's lots of combined authorities talking about giving power back to the authorities for how they can choose to run their transport and what their transport will look like, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, etc. into the future. And a lot of that, as Melanie mentioned in the first presentation, is building on the work that TfL have rolled out and sort of flagshipped, and then the work that Transport for Cornwall has done, and then TFGM more recently. And I think it's also been seen around the local transport minister saying that actually there is a real wide range of options for what integration and what franchising look like, both in an urban and rural setting. And I think it's about, those identities, those brands that are associated with the franchising to actually make transport cool and attractive again. I think you see that with the B network. Everyone's kind of associating the B network with Manchester, and they think of it as the B network rather than, oh, it's some buses or it's some other modes of transport. And I think that's the real key thing that we can build on and improve going forward. Next slide, please. So in terms of how DRT plays a role, it's about the service configurations. What do we want to work for in order to make sure that this, the integrated transport offering, whether that's with bus, whether that's with rail, whether that's with tram, is actually working. And I think it's about mixing up these different service configurations to reflect the different time of day, the target customer, actual nature of the specific areas are going to be covered. And the sort of chop and change from service design is about making sure that we are always thinking with the customer in mind, and therefore getting more bums on seats, driving that revenue to make sure that the network really meets the different demands of those that are going to use it. I think just sticking with one option and keeping it the same all day every day is kind of just hoping that you'll induce some change from that, but actually tailoring it to people's needs, whether that's getting people to a train station in the morning and home in the evening, and then leisure trips throughout the middle portion of the day. That's how we can best do it. And I think that's where DRT best has its role to help support the other modes of transport that it's integrating with. Next slide, please. And so it's not just chopping and changing in the service design. I think it's chopping and changing actually how these services are funded. Melanie and John also touched on this, but I think at the moment transport is really quite siloed across public transport, how CT is funded. I've seen some discussion in the chat and the Q&A boxes around also SEN school transport and patient transport as well. And actually, we're not just talking about integration here on all the transport modes, but we're also talking about integration of different funding pots at a national level. If we want to, integrate and have services running for commuters and then leisure users and then school children, etc., we need to think not just about the modes they're going to take, but how the different funding pots can be used. And I think we almost need to de-silo this in a way, but also make sure that the service that we do blend or we do mix are suitable and reflective of the different types of users, their mobility needs, their other needs accordingly. And therefore, from a operational standpoint, how are we then using the assets and the vehicles to make sure that the services can continue for as long as possible and are being interworked and managed to the best of their opportunity. Next slide, please. So it's about also the brand. We talked about this with the TFGM. When you've got multiple services in multiple areas, that brand, that logo, that vision that people see on a livery of the vehicle as it goes past is really, really important. I think we're very proud, with Padam in the UK, with the brands that we work with. So some of the services there that you can see of what local authorities have gone for. You've got the Robin, you've got Surrey Connect, Hearts Links, and the Hampshire service. And I think touching on John's point, these are almost all exclusively delivered by community transport. We have just a handful of services in the UK that are run by commercial operators. So it's that recognizing that CT can get involved in these slightly more commercial elements, but also their subset of users is really appealing to them, and they're creating a really recognizable brand that resonates with the users. And it's giving people that gateway approach of what they can see. And I think sometimes DRT is a bit of a gateway to the wider transport system. We see amongst our user base when we run surveys and we understand sort of user behavior that some people who use DRT would not use a bus because they have certain opinions and views of what a bus is and how it represents for their type of transport. But actually, if we're able to generate some modal shift and get some people out of their cars, like Melanie was talking about, to then use DRT in the first 6 months, and then in the second 6 months use that as a multimodal journey to get them to take a bus or a train journey further forward, then that in turn is creating that success and giving a brand that's recognizable, that seems a little bit cooler and a little bit more attractive to use than just generic bus service getting me from A to B. And therefore we can then support them in sort of growing their intermodal journey approach. Next slide, please. So it definitely is moving towards that shared landscape where both DRT and fixed line buses can work together. I think the time I've been doing DRT, which is coming up to a decade, has seen those barriers been built up between the bus industry and how DRT can work. But now those barriers are being removed. It's about complementing the networks together rather than sort of cannibalizing patronage and working that way. So I think what we're trying to do is get people to points where they can interconnect or take trains, but it's all about the careful consideration and how you restrict or limit certain journeys that can be made, and that in turn then induces the customer behavior to help inform and encourage more multimodal journeys. And the map here is of our service in Hertfordshire, the Herts Links, and it's a really rural area. It's about 150 square miles. It's up to 7 vehicles at the moment, but it did start initially with 3. But 1 in 5 journeys is starting or ending at a railway station or bus interchange, and 1 in 6 is going to a place of education. So we are really seeing people start to change their habits around how they work. And due to the service design that we've implemented, you can travel from any green stop to any green stop or any green stop to a purple stop. But into purple stops, travel is not possible. So, for example, Stevenage to Bishop Stortford, there are relatively regular fixed line services that can do that. Stevenage to Hertford, there's a railway service as well. So, carefully considering how we want the service to behave naturally induces people's decision making. They will then no longer take a 15-mile DRT service when there's a bus service that's running every 20 or 30 minutes to do so. And by limiting the number of stops in the town centre, you are further helping induce that. But if you only make the stops there, the post office or the bus stop, interchange or the railway station, people are naturally going to gravitate and then make more multimodal journey options themselves by the fact that you've just given them a relatively limited or carefully considered, however you want to phrase it, choice of where they can be picked up or dropped off. And that way, the sort of wider transport ecosystem of DRT and fixed line bus, starts to exist in a much better balance. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share this couple of examples from 2 of our clients in Scandinavia, because I think the way that they're approaching things is hopefully kind of how the UK is starting to reposition itself with franchising, with regional control over transport systems. Is now we've had Cornwall, we've had Manchester Goers, and we see how the engagement is working for the other combined authorities. They're starting to be more bold and more content in what they want to do and how they want to achieve it. And that, I think that kind of reflects what we see of some of the Scandi customers that we have. They kind of know their problem, they think they know how to act on it, and they just act on it. They're willing to give it a go, almost put their neck on the line for the transport system and get it running. So Gothenburg, it's an area with a population of about 900 to 1 million. So it's kind of the greater Leeds area, for example. And they have an on-demand service that is focused solely around feeding into higher frequency services and more direct routes to an urban centre from a suburban hub. Now, those higher frequency services are every 30 minutes to every 20 minutes, and is solely sort of your express service into the town centre. And they've integrated that into a journey planning option. So they've got sort of a medium level mobility as a service application where you can see your end-to-end journey with your walking to your stop, you're walking from the stop, and then on to your connecting mode of transport as well. But they've also then removed some of the lower frequency services that were underperforming to help supplement this with the on-demand service. So I think they removed 3 or 4 bus routes. They've got 2 areas with 2 to 3 vehicles depending on the time of day in as well. And I think therefore, like Melanie mentioned, running bus service is expensive, and it's all about how can we drive the revenue, how can we increase the access to services whilst focusing on what we can deliver financially as well. And therefore they're giving confidence, they're focusing on how can people connect rather than sort of the ad hoc journeys. And I think that's a really important thing to think about going forward. If we want to increase the revenue we retain, we need to make sure the service is designed for the people who will drive those revenue streams. Next slide, please. And speaking about that driving revenue and thinking about how we can attract on it, this is a service in Copenhagen where we launched initially with just that you can go from anywhere to anywhere, and through the data collection and through the demand analysis, actually they're really changing how they want things to be worked. They rework their service, so we're focusing on feeding into night bus services and feeding into morning services in the morning. We're now focusing on the key train stations to get people into the wider Copenhagen area in the morning and afternoon. And we've just recently added in mainstream school bus passengers, which would be the equivalent here in the UK, to get people to and from 2 different schools in this sort of suburban town area. And therefore, they're doing that chop and change approach. So the service actually looks really different throughout the day, but it's actually telling a really great story. Of the morning, we focus on getting people to the train station for 7:30 to catch their trains in for work, and they'll come back at 5:30. From 7:30, we're then getting the school children to where they need to be to get to school. And then we are focusing on leisure journeys, people taking children or families to markets, to the shops, or other journeys. And then we reverse that completely in the afternoon. And actually, that chop and change is giving really, really high options for patronage. And we've also integrated into their Riser Planner, which is their national journey planner. And I think at a time when, mobility as service is still kind of being understood or re-understood here in the UK, the Riser Plan app is actually more used in Denmark than Google Maps. So it shows if you can get it right and you design it carefully, mobility as service can succeed and can be delivered with correct levels of public uptake. Next slide, please. So just to kind of wrap up and before we jump into the Q&A, I think we've really reached a key point with what UK public transport looks like. There's a lot of reform going on, whether that's the buses bill, whether that's GBR and everything, but actually how regions and cities can control their transport, I think in the next 5 years is really exciting to give more power to them. Franchising, as the other panelists have mentioned, can exist in multiple forms, and I think how they do that is best suited to the region and focusing on what they deliver for their residents and customers. And DRT and us at Padam, our position on this is that we are an enabler. We're not the golden solution, but we can be a cog in this ecosystem. But we need other modes to feed into. If there's only a bus service every couple of hours, then there's not much we can feed into. But if there is a semi-regular service of every 40 minutes or every hour, then that gives us something to help direct passengers to. And the fact that we can have greater coverage with no fixed line means we can attract public transport demand in areas where there may be transport deserts and improve that coverage to then help drive it to areas of critical mass. And then finally, branding and identity, I think those are really important. Those are what create the trust. The reason I think that some of the community transport services are succeeding in doing DRT is because that's a brand that the community knows, that the public is then raising awareness of, and that sort of bedside manner that people expect on a DRT service is improved as well. But all of this is underpinned by a consistency of offer, whether that's for DRT, whether that's for fixed bus lines. I think the whole sort of ecosystem of bus operators and DRT providers and community transport have got to make sure that the offer is there and people can rely on the service, and therefore then you set your baseline to attract your customers. And with that, I'll hand back to Beate, and I think we will jump into some questions.
Hi. Thanks, James. Thanks very much for that. And thank you, everyone, for a very wide-ranging look at rural transport and different options in around the UK. We've had absolutely loads of questions, and we will do our best to do a bit of a Q&A roundup and send it out to people. But we probably won't be able to cover everything in the last half an hour of the webinar. There's quite a lot of interesting questions coming from the national park, people working in the national park authorities, and some complementary questions about a regional transport and travel. Just an interesting observation from Laurie Pickup, who's a freelance consultant, about levelling up policies resulting in money going from capital regions to large cities and other regions, but not from regional cities to surrounding rural areas for investment and growth. So, and he's asking, I'm assuming Laurie's he, sorry, I didn't ask, how might change in policy revitalise the rural transport offer? I won't ask this immediately because there's a similar question from Tim Nicholson at the Peak District National Park Authority. Given the high number of visitors to national parks, could transport authorities view them as cities with a transitory population when planning bus services? So let's look at this as regions. For instance, the Peak District receives 26 million visits per year, and 75% of them are from within 10 miles of the border. So how can rural transport play a role in and how can rural transport plans play a role in enabling people to travel between cities and less rural regions and rural regions? I think I'll start with you, Melanie, if that's okay.
Yep, sorry about that. Yes, lots of questions there. I mean, I think my view is very clear. Passengers don't respect boundaries. They want to move from A to B. And therefore, I do feel, that's my point, that we do need to be taking that more strategic view and look at where people are travelling and then fit what we need to do around that rather than keep focused on our administrative boundaries. So, absolutely, what is the role of boss in moving people around an area and the wider region? And we are seeing, a lot of combined authorities, coming together. And if we're not careful, money will be aimed at those, and the rural authorities are going to be left behind, certainly. So I think working with wider stakeholders and the pooling of resources is a way forward. I think John Carr put something in the chat. We've got to be less dependent on revenue funding. We've got to go out there and find the funding if we're going to make transport, if we're going to deliver a step change in rural transport provision. So lots of issues there, really. So yes, I'll stop there, I think.
I was on mute then. John, would you like to add anything? I have got an additional question for you about community transport. Just
that I think Laurie has identified a disconnect that exists in the current arrangements, and I've been conscious of the difficulties of interaction between, in the past, Cumbria County Council and the Lake District National Park, whose agendas are not necessarily in alignment, and that creates difficulties in terms of the sort of integration and consistency that Melanie's talking about. And similarly, in North Yorkshire, the very fact that the Dales and Bowland Community Interest Company is grappling with Sunday services there, which are, as it were, seen as not about the residents, but about tourists, and therefore, haven't been a priority for the county council to support. So those are two examples of the connections not coming together, and we need to overcome that.
Thanks. I have a question specifically, I think, for John and then James. How do you change the perception of small community buses and transport being solely for carrying pensioners to the shops? And that's from Alex Pringle on the South Downs National Park Authority. John?
Well, one way to do that is if you're a community transport group with a completely open arrangement for the type of groups that you're carrying, is actually to be carrying a lot of younger people. And you may well be doing that because you're doing group transport as well as individual transport. So you will be carrying young people to collective sports or outdoor pursuits, or even services which as it were, replace the parental taxi in the evening, and enable young people to access towns and then get home safely. So by doing that, you alter the perception of who the service is for. So Thanks. Yeah, just do it.
I'm going to ask James, because I know that the DRT, some of the DRT schemes that Padam has powered have had similar kind of effects.
Yeah, I think I agree with John that it just needs to be done. And I think there is that removal of the stigma around what community transport is. I think a lot of people think it's for anyone but them, basically. It is viewed as perhaps just for the elderly or the disabled, or both. People don't think that you could be in a wheelchair in your, late 20s and use community transport. They think that you have to be both elderly and disabled to use the service. And I think some of the repositioning around that we've done with the DRT services, people don't really realise it's run by CT, because actually, although it is a CT vehicle, rather than spending, and to link this back to the the capital funding approach, rather than spending £100,000 on a new accessible vehicle, actually spending a few £1,000s on just a new livery and changing it from and John, you probably know this better than me, but dial-a-ride beige is probably the shade that I would call it, but actually just putting a green livery or a yellow livery, something that's marketable and visible, then people change their perception. And in Hertfordshire, for their dial-a-ride service, not strictly to DRT, they've done that where they have a fleet of 15 or 20-year-old dial-a-ride buses that are fully accessible, but actually just changing the color of them with a livery completely changes the perception of how people use it. And when those vehicles are covering on the regular DRT service, in case of vehicle breakdowns or routine inspections, people don't bat an eyelid because they see the black and green of Hertz Links that they are used to. They don't look at the registration plate to see what age it was. Actually, it's a vehicle that's got black and green livery on the outside. The seats are comfortable and it's going to get me from A to B. And I think it's a really financially savvy way to attract people to your service. Don't do all your new vehicles, just change how maybe the public could perceive them.
Yeah, can I just say, I think we really need to nurture the community transport providers in our rural areas and really work with them to find a role for them. There is a valid role, and if we're not careful, they will start to disappear, just like we're seeing lots of small operators disappear. We're not going to have the next generation coming through. Within rural areas, they absolutely have a role to play in providing those linkages from the more remote villages that you can't justify bus services and getting them into the public transport system. So I think we do need to do more thinking around how we bring them along and work with them in rural areas and really nurture their success and make sure they are part of the picture.
Just to give an example, a practical example on the branding aspect, we designed a brand livery for Middlesbrough dial-a-ride at a time when Stagecoach was the incumbent operator there, and we took Stagecoach's colours, reversed the order of the orange and blue, put a swoop down the side of the minibus. So anybody looking at it would have actually thought this community transport is actually fully part of the bus, the conventional network.
Thanks. I'm just going to ask a very specific question to John from David Miles, who's a small community transport operator. Is it possible to reach the stringent criteria for franchising and tendering? How can small operators survive in a centralised system? Which sort of also chimes in with Melanie. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, but I'll go to John first.
Well, the stringent criteria kind of depend on what's written into the documentation in the franchise. There's nothing inherent that there's a particular stringent difficulties. Doesn't necessarily have to be a full-scale public service vehicle operating license to participate in a franchise. The difficulties are more likely to be any scale barriers that exist for the community transport to do anything in its own right. And I think I'm much more interested in identifying partnership arrangements between community transports and whoever else is going to be bidding for the overall franchise network.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that, John. And I think, we really do need to look at, the big commercial operators. There is a lot more they could be doing in terms of working in conjunction and in partnership with community transport providers to bring people into their networks. The commercial environment, everybody's been in competition with one another and everybody's afraid. We've got to move on from that now. There's so much public subsidy going into the networks now. The local authorities, the operators need to be thinking, where are the opportunities for CT and how can we get them on board? I don't see franchise, CT isn't going to be franchised in areas. It's around how CT can support the wider core networks that may or may not be franchised or delivered through partnership. It's how they bring more people into core networks. That's how I see them really supporting the wider plans going forward.
And just to be clear, I've got a question here from John Lew at Calderdale, who's interested in the potential conflicts between franchise bus services and permit operated services. Are you saying whether that the permit operated services will disappear into franchising, or are you saying that they can continue to coexist?
Franchising is simply a means of, it's a type of contract, as somebody pointed out in the chat. Well, there are going to be things that are included in that contract, but the community transport sector is, it should be focusing on identifying gaps and needs, right? That's what it's traditionally been about. And in any franchise that gets put out, there are going to be things which are affordable for the authority and things which are not affordable. Well, the community may say they don't agree with what the authority has defined as affordable, so they want to actually put other services on. So that will be potentially feasible. I can't see a legal means by which a franchise could prevent community transport permit operation in the same way that under franchising they could prevent competitive bus operation.
Melanie?
Yeah, no,
You're nodding.
just the same. Yeah.
Okay, short answer then. I've got a question for James from Roger Sexton. Where a DRT service fits into a mainline bus, boat, tram or train service, how can you ensure that timetables interconnect and that there are through fares? I think the through fares is more a policy issue, but I think timetabling you can talk about maybe.
Yeah, yeah, through fares is definitely, particularly here in the UK with the ticketing standards and how I think, as Melanie mentioned, simplifying a £2 and £3 fare instead of having about 100 different bus returns that are some accepted on competitors, some aren't, and similarly with the rail network. But I think in terms of actually guaranteeing connections, it's a data standard point. And, not only a data standards point, but actually a meaningful data collection exercise. If we collect loads of data, then that's great, but we actually need to know that the data we've got is the right one. So we can do this through GTFS, which is General Transit Format Standard, or GTFS Flex, which is the real-time sort of dynamic one, which then will tell you, when you're waiting at a bus stop in, traditionally major cities, of the bus is 4 minutes away, then 3 minutes away, oh, it's still in traffic, so it's still 3 minutes away after a couple of minutes, rather than just saying the 11:04 bus is the number X, and then 11:04 passes, and actually that vehicle is not in service, so that journey doesn't run. And we do a lot of work to ensure those connections. It's more of a question of how, on a journey planning exercise, does the region or transport authority want to progress? Do they want just the static format, which is a little bit more accessible, or do they want the sort of more dynamic real-time information to allow those connections to take place? And I think the challenge we have in the UK is actually the actual quality of that data. It's not sort of massively well up to date outside of the major cities, so we need to make sure that that's more accessible, from a regional but also from a local standpoint. Whereas in Europe, with these sort of de facto franchise reasons already, that service is really readily available, right down from the really high frequency service in an urban centre to the low frequency suburban routes.
Does anyone else want to add anything?
Just on ticketing, I mean, Cornwall got their bus operators in a good place, and we're looking to roll that out across the wider region, the Peninsula Transport region, so that but no matter what bus, tickets can be accepted. Cornwall are also doing a lot of work with rail at the moment in terms of getting the pay-as-you-go system delivered across their rail network, and then that enables bus and rail to then hopefully talk to one another when GBR gets its act together. So the steps are being put into place. I think the key is to get the bus systems all sorted within regions, within areas, and then you connect with rail and obviously ferry as well. I think the other thing to point out, we do have Plus Bus. It's, those that know, those that don't, but again, there's work going on that's now online or going online, I believe. So that provides greater levels of accessibility. Manchester have just integrated bus and tram. So you have integrated ticketing now within Manchester, within the B network on bus and tram, and obviously rail when they take control of the rail in the coming years. I'm sure that will then integrate as well, and rail will hopefully be in a better place. And we've got Project Coral coming along that hopefully will make the back office a whole lot easier, certainly on the bus side of things. So again, we can then work with the rail industry. So yeah, the steps have been taken. It shouldn't have taken this long, but as usual, we are where we are in this country. We make things 10 times harder. But what I say to every authority is you've got to start looking at your ticketing and your fares with your operators and simplify. Because if you don't simplify, you're going to be in a mess when all this technology sorts itself out. And we still have local authorities with their own fare bands that are wholly different to local authority operator fare bands, and all that needs to start being looked at and simplified, and it isn't being done in most areas at the moment.
Yes, I hear you completely. Just a quick one from the Q&A. James, presumably the Gothenburg, there's through ticketing on the DRT to the mainline services.
I'd have to double check, but I think it's almost done by default for the suburban rail, because there is kind of, a bit like a lot of European cities, there is a Gothenburg, city travel card. Imagine your Oyster card, but you can input those details. So it's a lot easier to control, because you're just essentially showing your card when you board, and then, it's got a subscription and you tap it on when you make your railway services. The payment is so much more simplified when we get that. Yeah, that's kind of where we are. I think that's like a lot of the other European services, they're integrated with the wider network. So actually your DRT is included in the cost of your monthly fee. So there's actually no real direct payment transaction happening. It's all just managed, through a third party with the sort of the remittance based on you took X amount of journeys in a month, some were rail, some were bus, some were DRT, and the how that's managed is then done at the side of the local authority.
So basically account-based ticketing for all.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's nice to hear that it's happening in some places. We're reaching the end of the webinar now, and I just thought to wrap up, I had a question from Ord Patel in Buckinghamshire Council. What are the top 3 policy requirements local plans should include to alleviate transport poverty and the lack of public transport in active travel in car-dependent areas? So your top 3 policy requirements. Do you want to start, James, and then we'll move to John and Melanie?
3. I think the first one needs to be that cross-boundary permittance for funding, and not ring fencing it to only be within that Buckinghamshire, for example, authority. People will need to access local services, education, healthcare across the boundary from where they live. So I think ring fencing that will make it possible. For my other 2, I think they kind of stem further down from that. I think it's about the legislation policy point, which I know is ongoing within the buses bill, about what is DRT and what does that look like as a definition of a service, so that legislation can support it, and we're not trying to hem DRT into something that is like a private hire or taxi service, or like a bus service, actually giving it its standalone position. And I think thirdly, the policy point is around recognizing that ticketing and journey planning can be made more simple. It's just about getting the data there. So uplifting the data knowledge, whether that's through BODs or other initiatives, making sure that then the quality of data is accessible to all and can enable providers like ourselves at Padam to recommend the right journey choices and options to people when they want to request them.
Thank you. John, do you want to go next?
Yep. And this is thinking about it from a community transport point of view. The first one, I think, is about ensuring that the authority operates corporately and therefore does think about the integration of the finance from the different pots. And I would point out that some of the new joint authorities are not responsible for school transport, which is a nightmare if you think about the relative value of spare public spend on school transport and on local bus support in the area. So my own authority, Lancashire, is one of those. So it's going to be really challenging as to how you could get packaged services between school transport and DRT or dial-a-bus on that basis. The second is a national plea rather than a local plea, and that is we need a review of community transport regulation because it's been creaking for a long time and is just leading to continued conflict, and that basically puts a damper on creative development of the kind we actually want to see here, with partnerships between community transport and local authorities and commercial operators. And then the third one would be some guidance in terms of the standards that are to be expected in terms of services in rural areas to avoid the sort of postcode lottery that you currently have, where there are different standards of service if you're in a village in Cornwall to if you're in the equivalent sized village in Cumbria or Northumberland.
Thank you. All very important. Melanie.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would echo what everybody's said so far. So it's about, you know, a right to public transport and the standards of service provision and making local authorities accountable. That's why this whole point about, you know, the subsidised service provision and you know, which are socially necessary. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think actually we do need that if we're going to transform people's lives and give them access to public transport and to improve equality around being able to access jobs, education and all of that side of things. So certainly more around that. I echo James's points about cross-boundary. You've got to think broader. You know, we're very compartmentalised within transport, and we've really got to break down these barriers now and think broader, think bigger. And really, you know, take that strategic wider view, and also the integrated ticketing. I think that has to come. It's not going to transform, I don't think. I don't think many people do, but for those that it does, it will be, you know, absolutely key. But it's about breaking down barriers. It's about making bus and public transport the easy option, as easy as picking up your car keys. And that's what we don't have at the moment. You have to make it easier for people to access public transport. They don't need to think about it. They just need to pick up the car keys and go. Instead, you walk out your door to your nearest bus stop and you go, and you don't think about it.
Thank you very much indeed. John, were you just trying to add something there? No. Right. Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very, very much to all three of you who are not just to help sharing your wisdom and knowledge on this webinar, but also are the people who are making it public transport the easier than picking up your car keys. I like to think of it like that. Thanks, Melanie. Both as DRT providers in consultancy and helping local authorities actually make that change. I think as the buses bill progresses through Parliament and includes the requirement that socially necessary services should be preserved and ensured, I think there's a hope in the UK that we can see some of that being protected and pushed to the fore with even in rural areas that have experienced extreme loss in bus. Anyone that's unsure at all needs to go and look at Carbon.Place, the University of Leeds's bus map, which shows the reduction in services since 2008. And it's an absolutely startling map that shows our rural areas have lost up to 100% of the frequency of buses that they've had in outside of city areas. So it's a real problem, and it's one that we really do need to turn around at the moment. And thank you all of you who've been part of this. I'd also just quickly like to say thank you to Landor for organising the webinar and also organising the Rural Quality Bus Conference, which is going to take place on the 17th of July. And you'll see at least some of us there. So that's another opportunity to look at the way that we can improve rural buses and create transport for people at the place they need and at the times they need it, getting to the places they need to go. So thank you very much, all of you. Thank you everyone who's been on the webinar from start to finish. And that's goodbye from me and the webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.